All right, welcome everybody to this episode of the Race to Revenue. I am thrilled to be joined today by my friend Patrick O'Leary from Alegeus. He is the VP of Growth Strategy and Operations, and we're talking today all about how to think about your forecasting and how to modernize your forecasting. So we're going to focus on that. We're going to talk about how your revenue teams can do more with less, especially important in these trying times with the tough macro environment. And then finally, we're going to talk about streamlining sales processes in the spirit of growing through adversity. So welcome, Patrick. Honor to have you here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Tell us a little bit about Alegeus.
Absolutely. So thanks, Kyle. Great to speak with you as always. Really looking forward to the conversation today. So just kind of a quick overview of myself. So I've spent a good amount of time in kind of the commercial excellence, rev ops, sales ops, et cetera, type spaces over the course of my career. Right now I'm with Alegeus, really kind of enjoying my time with Alegeus, working on HSAs, FSAs, and all these sort of kind of flexible benefit spending accounts. So really what we do is we provide a software platform for third-party administrators as well as health plans to provide flex spending accounts as part of the benefit packages that they offer to employers. So as kind of us as employees, we get the benefit of that by getting the ability to kind of get an HSA, get an FSA, get a commuter account, maybe a wellness or lifestyle spending account that really kind of enhances our experience as an employee, but also drives really frankly long-term kind of wealth and health for us. So as you think about that HSA, how do you go and make sure you're not just thinking about kind of near term, getting to the doctor and that sort of thing, but also, kind of long-term saving for retirement and all of that. So, really exciting space, the healthcare kind of industry and really being kind of at the convergence of healthcare and fintech is really, really, really exciting. So, again, thank you for having me and looking forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. And it's funny, I was about to ask, what industry do you say you belong to? Because you're kind of straddling a few different worlds: healthcare, financial services. Obviously, there's a huge tech component to what you're doing. So how do you think about the industry that you all are playing in?
Yeah. So, so like I said, fintech, absolutely, health tech, and then also kind of the benefit space. I think really core to what we do is the benefit space. And then there's the fintech and health tech component that plug in there.
Wonderful. Okay. And your role, VP Growth Strategy and Operations, what does that mean? Tell us a little bit about your day-to-day.
Yeah. And so, this title is kind of an interesting title. It's not necessarily one that is like an every company thing, but very much it's a rev ops role, right? And so I call it Growth Strategy and Operations, mostly because I report to our Chief Growth Officer, as she's not responsible for just revenue, but also thinking about kind of the overarching growth of the company across multiple different kind of lenses, especially thinking about marketing as well as sales. So rev ops as a whole is really sort of my remit. So you can kind of contextualize it that way.
Got it. Wonderful. Okay. So now let's get into the meat of our programming for today and talk about everybody's favorite topic, which is manual forecasting. Fortunately, not something that you all have to do anymore, but talk to us a little bit about kind of the risks of this manual forecasting process that so many companies are beholden to, this, what we think of as this three-headed hydra of spreadsheets plus CRM plus BI. What are the risks of running your forecasting in that kind of old school methodology?
Absolutely. So, I think really to kind of talk about the risks of an old school methodology, you have to kind of start with what are the goals of forecasting, right? So as I think about the goals of forecasting, one is, first and foremost, and this is the obvious one, we need to drive predictability into the business. This is why forecasting exists, or why it, kind of existed from way back when. And then, the other kind of two big things that I think about are, one, how do you drive accountability within the sales organization? ensure that, if they say they're going to hit a number, they're going to hit a number, right? What does commit actually mean? But then also productivity. And this is kind of maybe the dark horse of the bunch in terms of the goals, is that, I think actually forecasting can be a lever for driving sales productivity if done in the right way. The reason I say that is, if you think about a forecasting process, and if you think about an old forecasting process, it's generally a cumbersome monthly, week long of calls that pull reps out of the field. But then also where you don't get all the information that you need, and then reps are still answering questions over and over and over and over and over again, to be able to kind of provide the level of visibility the rest of the organization wants. So if I think about the 3 goals of forecasting, it's, that predictability, accountability, but also productivity. So as we kind of take that lens and then think about, some of the risks of, forecasting, whether it's with like a spreadsheets or CRM or a BI tool, et cetera, I think, kind of the problem and the challenge there really lies in that you kind of think about it as right? And it's never, we can just use a spreadsheet, or, we can just use the CRM, or, we can just use a dashboard, right? It's, okay, how do we go stitch this dashboard into this spreadsheet, pull the data out of the CRM to live, here and link all these things together, right? What that does is, that actually drives us to fail on all of those objectives. So if we think about, what, kind of back to those 3 objectives, what is that driving? It's driving a complicated workflow, right? That pulls our sales reps out of the field, and reduces the time that they're spending with, our customers. 2, it diminishes the accountability. I don't know if you've probably heard the phrase like, hey, that number looks wrong on that dashboard. How many times after you've heard that phrase have you had a productive conversation about the forecast, right? And so, and then lastly, kind of the predictability can be hit or miss, right? Yeah. So, how much insight, has a salesperson given you, and what percentage of kind of what's in their brain or what's in the CRM or what's in all of these different data sources, have you actually captured? I think another kind of just anecdote around the predictability side, you're relying really heavily on a salesperson to predict a number, right? That requires a lot of math. And like jokingly, I will say, salespeople are really good at math when they're calculating their commission. Someone once told me that salespeople can do calculus when they're calculating their commission, but no other time. Now, obviously, that's not true, and generally people can do math, right? But you don't want to have to rely on people to do this complex math, whether it's a salesperson, ops person, even a finance person, right? To be able to actually accurately call a number. So you lose on all 3 of those. Sort of goals.
I love the pillars that you just outlined, Patrick, the main goals of forecasting: predictability, accountability, productivity. And that focus on productivity is so important because you're right. I think this is the hidden pillar that most revenue teams and certainly leaders don't think about, which is if you are requiring your sellers to sit in these hour-long meetings and get interrogated over and over again and have to do all this manual forecasting work, you're stealing time from them that should be spent being productive selling. And we see all the time when we ask folks that are using spreadsheets or using CRM to do some sort of forecasting process, how much time do you think it takes? And their responses are somewhere in the 5 to 10 hours per rep per week ballpark. That's a huge amount of time. You're talking about up to a quarter of a rep's time just playing around in a spreadsheet. That's not how you want to deploy your troops. So I'm really happy that you focused on that as a main risk of productivity and then a main challenge that teams face, which is how do we actually operationalize this in a way that is useful? So I think this provides a good segue into the next question, which is, okay, if that's the old school way of doing things, what do you think about as the newer school or a modern approach to forecasting?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, we can talk about kind of like fast forward, and I would say, like, I think 5 years ago, I would have said 10 years, right? But now I'm probably talking 2 years, just because of kind of the developments in AI, et cetera.
Right.
But, let's talk about what the future state is, which is really this AI driven type of forecast with this human loop, right? And, obviously there's been a ton of, news, and everybody in LinkedIn's posting about like Chat GPT and all that fun stuff these days, right? Which is an awesome tool. But it's an awesome tool because it has a human loop embedded in it, right? As you think about many of the other types of AI tools that have kind of come on the market recently, you have one of two types. Either one, you have this kind of generalized model that, kind of takes a stab at something, and then there's a human loop. And then two, you have a very precise sort of predictive kind of algorithm that doesn't require human intervention. These are the types of things that are used in healthcare to analyze, like MRI readings, for example. We're probably not going to get to that type of algorithm for forecasting anytime soon, because it requires a ton of investment and a ton of kind of refining to kind of get to that level. That said, we can very quickly get to the other model where we have this kind of human loop with an AI backbone to kind of drive, forecasting, drive the kind of the majority of the effort that goes into forecasting. As I think about kind of that state and then maybe dial it back a couple of years, I think there's a few kind of key things that are incumbent to modern forecasting. One, it's more frequent. So historically, we'd have this every month process that would take a week. Now we're getting to, weekly forecasts, right? Sometimes even daily forecasts that don't require, people sitting in any meetings to be able to, kind of roll that up. Maybe you just flip a couple things in Salesforce and you can roll up a forecast, right? So one, it's more frequent. Two, it's insanely easy to complete. So kind of tying into the other point, if you want a weekly forecast, it can't take a week to complete, right? Because then you're not going to be consuming 5% of your salesperson's time. You're going to be consuming 100% of it.
Right.
So, it has to be easy to complete. I think the other piece that's really a new kind of new-ish phenomenon over the course of the past couple of years is it incorporates everything that you know. And so historically, there's been this, I'm going to put a number in a CRM against an opportunity, and then we're going to argue about that number, right? Very much now we're incorporating so many more data sources and so many more kind of elements to A, help have a better conversation, but also B, kind of provide an additional level of accuracy in a fuller picture. So a couple of things that I'll kind of call out here, right? Around one, this product-led growth trend, right? I mean, we're many years into the cycle there. And we're really starting to see kind of how we're evolving tools as an industry to help tackle that challenge of these more almost consumption-based motions, right, where they require much lower touch from a salesperson. How do you go create a full revenue forecast when you have, a bunch of salespeople focusing on your big deals, right? And you incorporate that insight alongside, this consumption-based motion. The other piece of this too is it's not just about talking about all the revenue that's coming in, but it's also talking about the quality of that revenue. So thinking about everything from like how do you go take Gong or take Wingman and pull those insights into your deal forecasting to help drive that predictive model, whether human aided or not, to be able to kind of better articulate the forecast. And then I think the last kind of, go ahead, sorry.
Just the point that you're making, Patrick, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but the point that you're making that I really want everybody to take home is that a modern approach to forecasting requires a redefinition of forecasting. And you're hitting the nail on the head. 10 years ago, it was a bottoms-up exercise where it was manually, inputted by a rep and then rolled up to leaders, and that was the forecast. That is not acceptable in today's world because of the sheer amount of data and signal that revenue teams have now that they didn't have before. So yes, the bottoms up forecast is still extremely important, but so too is the machine learning and AI driven understanding of your past, and then the predictive analytics that the machine is calling for your future. And what revenue leaders do is they're able to take all these different data points and triangulate a forecast. Very different from a bottoms up roll up, and more about a fuller understanding of all the different things that affect revenue and pulling that together into a single call. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I'd add, I think, two other things as we think about kind of that, and it's really the cultural element of this. As we think about kind of the tooling and bringing kind of everything that you know to bear, it's also about, driving kind of the transparency, accountability, but also empowerment along the management chain. So yes, maybe some of the focus is kind of coming off of that bottoms up roll up, but that just means that we can have better conversations against that, roll up, so that we can dive deeper into insight. We can kind of get better aligned as one team around our deals.
Makes a lot of sense. And so now as we think about kind of putting this into practice, Patrick, you've talked about this exercise used to be a monthly thing that took a week. Now it's a weekly and sometimes even daily exercise to submit a forecast. You talk about efficiency. That's huge. So how have you operationalized this methodology? How are you forecasting both efficiently as well as accurately? Because it doesn't matter how fast you do it if it's totally inaccurate. So how do you do both those things, efficiency and accuracy?
Yeah. So I think there's, overarching theme. Measure it, right? If you're not actually measuring the process or measuring the accuracy or measuring kind of the outcome, you aren't going to be able to make, progress on it. And then B is, kind of actually, as you measure it and as you get some of these insights, make consistent progress. It doesn't mean that you have to go and rip out your entire forecasting process next month. And try and incorporate every single possible data point that right? All that means is if you're doing something in a spreadsheet today and you're building you're manually building an analysis in Excel, and yes, it still does happen. Maybe move it to a BI tool, right? Start that journey and start the evolution of, kind of month over month. How can I make progress against driving a more efficient, driving a kind of higher accountability forecasting process? I think a few kind of thoughts underneath that. One, it starts with culture. You have to drive a positive sales culture that we win together and we lose together. If you don't start with that, everything else is meaningless. Because you start to get salespeople doing things that they don't want to be doing, right? To hedge and to hide and, all of those sorts of things. Kind of that just gets in the way of forecast accuracy. So one starts with sales culture. Two is, stop enabling excuses with your process. And so I talked about that dashboard scenario earlier. The more complicated your process is, the more excuses you'll have. So simplify across every step in the process, so that you can drive kind of the accountability. And then I think, so I mentioned kind of bringing in all the information. Absolutely do that. Think about all the data points that you can bring in that would be helpful, not just are there, but would be helpful to providing an accurate forecast. And then lastly, I would say stop trying to fit kind of a square peg into a round hole to some respect. And what I mean by that is your Salesforce report and your spreadsheet are probably not going to solve this problem for you. There are better tools on the market today, right? And it probably makes sense to start looking at how you kind of evolve this process, even if it's just to a BI tool as a step one, right? How do you move out of a spreadsheet and kind of to a predictable, repeatable, very standard process that then you can document and you can measure and you can kind of improve upon over time?
It's super interesting. And this balance that you are striking from a process standpoint is really important. You've mentioned you want to have a simple process, but you want to have guardrails. You want to make sure that there is a standardized way that your sales team is prosecuting their deals. And it's really important because if you have those clear entry and exit criteria, I assume it makes it a lot easier for you to spot risk in those deals, for you to pressure test the stage or forecast category that a deal is in, look at your stage criteria and understand what's on track and what's off track, and then have a productive conversation about what needs to happen to move things forward. Is that a fair assessment? How do you go about spotting risk inside these deals?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about have a process and measure that process, right? Mm-hmm. From a forecasting perspective, it's the same exact thing from a sales workflow and sales process perspective. So one, have a process. Two, measure that process. As I think about deal risk, I think about it in three categories. One, is it going to close? Two, is it going to close on time, right? Or is it going to slip a quarter? Is it going to slip a year, right? And then three, is it going to close at the stated amount, right? As you think about kind of each of those three categories, I think one comes down to alignment, right? How do you, create kind of a mutual action plan with your customer, measure it with like MedPick or Medic or, one of those sorts of things to make sure you got the economic buyer, right? And you can flag those areas of risk as part of your deal. So it becomes less, I think it's going to happen, right? And more, I have these four things in place, but these four things are outstanding. That indicates a 50% risk on this deal. Two, think about, as I mentioned, kind of the on time piece. This is all about, essentially the paper process of the deal. So if you don't have pricing 3 days before a deal closes, pretty sure that deal's not going to happen, at least on time, right? So map out those steps, measure them, understand how long they take, and that can provide you really good insight into whether it's going to close on time. And then lastly, at the stated amount, I think is actually the easiest one of these to solve for, which is all about kind of just the appropriate discovery upfront with your customer. At the end of the day, there's no reason why they should be hiding from you what they want, right? If you're having a discussion with them. If you're not at the point where you can fully concretely define what you're trying to deliver to them, you're probably much earlier on in the sales cycle than like a stage 6 or a stage 7 or something like that, right? So make sure that if you don't have confidence around that, you're reflecting the stage accurately. So those would be kind of the three things that I would think about as I think about, kind of deal risk.
And a lot of those things, a really helpful overview, by the way, Patrick, a lot of those things are reliant on having the right leadership. You mentioned starting with culture, ensuring that everybody's on the same page. But a lot of what you talked about can also be operationalized with technology. Software, as in general, is meant to make people be able to do more with less, and revenue technology is no different. So how are you've mentioned already this sort of digital transformation, to borrow a phrase, from spreadsheets to CRM to BI to other sorts of systems. How do you think about technology's role in allowing you and your team to do more with less?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is like nothing exists in a silo, right? So, as you make technology improvements, there are, trade-offs, right, that you can make, time spent improvements, right? Working with kind of antiquated processes. So, as I think about, the kind of concept of doing more with less, it's very much the way that I've always approached it is in order to optimize my kind of like people cost, right? I need to make sure they're working on the most valuable things. The way that I do that is I invest in technology. to, shrink the amount of time that they spend on, certain processes. So as you think about that in a, kind of sales motion, or even in kind of my organization, one of the things that I did over the course of the past year is I implemented a compensation system, right? And we did it manually before. Compensation's, by the way, a huge time consumption process for almost any company, right? But I have someone who's managing forecasting and commissions for me. Now that commission system's in place, I'm going to be able to take that person and I'm going to be able to up level them, and they're going to be able to spend so much more time working on board decks and working on making sure that, we're thinking about kind of the full go-to-market organization in a much more holistic sense. The same is true for the sales team, right? So as we take time off of, time off of their plates that they used to have to spend on forecasting, then they can spend so much more time with their customers, ultimately driving revenue for us and increasing kind of sales productivity. So I think about it very much in kind of those couple of levers.
It's a really smart way to think about it. And I know a lot of folks, they may get intimidated, Patrick, by a new technology that is replicating a part of their job. And they may think, well, this technology expenditure is just going to replace me. And that's not the right way to think about it. The right way to think about it is exactly what you just said, which is this technology is going to do the more rote parts of your job that you don't like doing. And frankly, I don't want you spending time on. I want to give that to the software, give that to the machine so that you can go and focus on the more thoughtful, strategic work that's going to make a bigger impact to the company and become a multiplier effect for you in your career, but also for us as a company and the way we think about what's working and what isn't. So I love that journey that you're on right now.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think, we hear a lot in the news these days around, kind of various events happening. And, I think I could say a million things about that, right? But that's very much not what technology investment is about, right? At least for me, like it's not about let's go invest in technology so that we can cut. It's what can we accomplish with that time that we've now saved that is going to be accretive for the business.
It's exactly right. And I can't believe it, but we're already at time here, Patrick.
That was fast.
It was super fast. Thank you so much for the wisdom. Such a great perspective on how to think about traditional forecasting, how companies can start edging their way toward a more modern way of forecasting. And you're proof positive that thinking differently and investing the time up front for processes and systems of collaboration of your team and governance for your processes, how that investment up front is going to pay dividends for yourself, for your company down the road. So thank you so much for the wisdom. Really, really appreciate it. Where can people go to find out more about yourself? Where can they go to find out more about Alegeus?
Sure, absolutely. So, my LinkedIn, I think my thing is Patrick O'Leary. So it's really, really simple. And then Alegeus.com. Have a ton of information there around kind of what we offer and how we support some of our partners, but also kind of how you can kind of get in touch with some of our partners around their offering, which we power. So. Yep. Thank you again, Kyle. I really appreciate kind of spending the time with you today. It's been a great conversation, and looking forward to continued forecasting progress.
Thanks so much, Patrick.